Welcome back. We're still here with Chelsea Gambles, professor at SU in the Family Life and Human Development Department, and we have been talking about pre-learning strategies. Now, Chelsea, I have to ask one question because I'm going through a doctoral program, and I know what informed consent means to me.
Okay.
But I feel like there's probably that it's slightly different when we talk about informed consent when we're teaching students versus when I'm doing research.
Yeah, or like in the medical field, right? When you go to your doctor, you sign paperwork that says, So informed consent started with healthcare generally, but to me it applies to contracting for all learning, and the idea is just it's the process of communication between you and your student that should lead to some kind of agreement for learning. So I have several ways. So there's some principles to me that go along with that. The biggest one, and this is in my teaching philosophy, is this kind of right to self-determination. So it's and this is what we teach students in healthcare too. When we're talking about do we hospitalize a patient, right? The principle is we want to have the least restrictive means necessary. And as an educator, I think we want to respect the right to self-determination to the extent that we can, right? To the greatest degree that we can. And then we want to be supporting and then clarifying all along the way. So just like we talk about when we talk about the talk, like the sex talk, hopefully people now know that should never just be one talk. It should be layers and layers and layers that start as a young child.
Right.
To me, the minute you start working with your student, informed consent should be layers upon layers of informed consent all along the way. So the obvious one is the syllabi, right? And that's an easy way. The first day of class, most professors have their version of like, this is what you should expect, right? And then, but anytime, so I try to do it before any emotionally charged topics. And I have heard students when I'm listening, when I shouldn't be, I referenced that in the last one, maybe not shouldn't be, but they're not talking to me directly. Something I hear all the time is they should have warned us. Like, we were going to hear this thing, or we were going to talk about this, and they should have warned us. Or he adjusted the due date, and there was no warning, right? Or something like that. So anytime there's a change of any kind, there should be some discussion. And again, back to this concept of accountability, I feel that instructors should own everything that they can own about it. So if you should have told them sooner, or if you messed them up, just like we show in medical health research that when physicians own their mistakes, they're less likely to get sued. Not that we're just trying to avoid negative course evals, but it increases safety. Right? So anytime you make a mistake, because students feel gaslit, and sometimes they are. And so that idea of like, no, it was always on and I've been guilty of that too. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, it's up, but I know I just put it up. If you know that you made a mistake, or not even a mistake, you made a change, you got updated information, the more that you can model that increases that level of informed consent, so they're not questioning what haven't you told them, or what other additional changes are you just going to throw at them. I get to where I do say to students, like, a trigger warning or something like that, I could do that every single class. So instead, I'm going to try to be intentional around the things that might surprise you, right? The things that maybe fall outside of the norms of what we've already talked about or whatever. And then, like I said, anytime the information has updated or changed. So because, again, there's a lot of things like that. I think anything that just as long as you're trying to be, for me, it's trying to be very intentional around the student's right to self-determination through that lens, that idea that everyone has their own internal learner. And our job is not to create that, it's to foster that. And so anytime that you can update them and own your own piece, to me, that's informed consent. And it's the biggest thing that is protective in therapy. So if a student's like, I want to see you every day in therapy, why can't I? Right? We have at CAPS the rights and responsibilities. I actually go over my own personal informed consent in our ethics class, and I let them pick it apart. What's there, what's not there, whatever. But I can go back to that contract and say, this is what we agreed to, right? And everyone understands generally why contracts are important. And when you're asking students to do things that are uncomfortable, which I think all of us should be, but students notice it differently, right? Like, I think there's a norm around math being hard, and students expect that to an extent. Everyone knows that OChem is like one of the hardest classes on campus. It might bring more students to therapy than any class, right? But to me, these more emotionally nuanced type of courses that disrupt your sense of safety in terms of I'm a good person, the world around me is safe, I contribute to in a way that's meaningful meaningful to me, we disrupt those in a lot of family science classes. And so that's where you have to look at what might they not be informed around, and then just kind of do your best to over-educate. And in the beginning, everybody knows they're not listening necessarily to the syllabi, or, you know.
What is it? There's that video of Snoop Dogg saying it's in the syllabus or something like that. Yeah, I know what I mean, even on online courses, even though we say you need to read the syllabus first, I'm horrible at that. I scan it real quick and I move on. But I do think you bring up a really good point that syllabus really is kind of a contract between a faculty member and their student. Yep. And so if you're going to adjust that contract, you've got to be transparent. It got me thinking about a professor I spoke with recently who talked about a forensics class that she teaches. And they deal with some pretty heavy topics, like domestic abuse, things like that. And what would you be doing as a forensics expert in this situation? And I know that she's been very open from the get-go. Like, there are going to be some really tough topics for some of you. You know, you've experienced domestic abuse, and so when we get to that unit, talk to me, and we can come up with alternatives.
Yes.
You know, and thinking about it from her perspective, one thing that really stands out to me compared to what you're saying is she's giving those students an out, saying there's more than one way for you to show that you understand this content. This might not be the best way because it's going to take you to some rough spots.
Yes.
Let's go this route instead.
Yes. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that was another thing Dr. Sarah and Allen suggested to me around the book clubs. And I just attended the National Teaching Family Sciences Conference, and they talked about this idea too. I think it was Weber University of all places. They're over in Puerto Rico talking about, but they were talking about the battle that they've had between, if they pick a certain memoir or something like that, they really want the student to read that specific one versus offering lots of options or a few different options. And I've heard faculty but I do think ultimately choice is really important. And so those alternatives, and you can't give someone an alternative if they don't know why they're having to choose an alternative, which is the informed consent piece. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been thinking about that, because as much as I want students to read this specific one, because I'm like, no, you got to jump in, because you're going to be hearing this in short years probably, right?
Yeah. Because you're thinking about the program long term.
I am.
And what am I doing in this class that's going to set them up for success a year or two down the road? Whereas even as a student now, I'm not thinking 2 to 3 years down the road. I'm thinking, what am I doing now?
Yep. How do I get through right now?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think one way to think of it is anyone who has deconstructed religion, for example, or their own family system, right? Maybe an upbringing, they're like, I have the best family ever. And then later they go, oh, there was some problems in my own childhood upbringing, or a marriage, or a close friendship that you thought was everything. And then later, or even like a sports group or a club that you belong to, that later you go, oh, okay. Dang, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to that. There's excavation that happens in that work. That's essentially what every social worker has to do, right? And probably every learner, if they're going to be, skilled in their field, but specifically around a lot of the family sciences, is there's a lot of excavating that has to be done there. And so we do have to start young, or start in the beginning and start kind of developing that scaffolding. But students, like you pointed out, are often just in the micro kind of moment to moment, and they're like, why are you doing this to me?
Right.
And I get that, because I went through my graduate program at the University of Utah feeling deeply attacked the entire 2 years. I was sure that they were all just anti-Mormon, and they all hated Mormons. And I was just sure that's how it was. And it was probably 5 years later that I went, oh, I get why they were asking me to do this work. So if I can help students not have to do that part, like they might not get it, but they might not feel like they're just being blindsided, then I feel like, okay, I've done the best I can.
And that can be really tough. I think back to my undergrad. I won't tell you how long ago that was. But we had I went to a small private Christian school, and we had a course called Christian Heritage. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't like, it wasn't like going to church. It was being extremely critical of the Bible.
Oh, interesting.
Which I thought was, looking back now, I'm like, I went to a Christian school, but they were very critical of the stories that were told growing up. And I can remember so many of us being upset,
I bet.
This is not what I've been told my whole life.
Right.
But I think back to it now and how much better that made me to take that step back. So it's funny how down the road we do reflect back, they weren't trying to be mean to us. They were preparing us because they see a bigger picture than we can see in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's my hope that we can kind of bridge that gap, right?
Yeah.
And even sometimes data is just triggering. Not like in sexuality, we talk about how, the research really supports the idea of certain sexual expressions that might go against someone's religion. And so even just sometimes basic things like that to me are just data because I don't have that lens of either a religious perspective or something else, it can be very challenging. So the point I'm trying to make there is that you also might not understand what certain things are going to stick, but if, or that are going to rub, I guess is a better way. But if you've kind of established a structure there, then you don't have to always know what's going to trigger people and give that warning, because it could be the most benign thing that triggers someone, right?
Yeah.
So, it could be a discussion about water. So, just normalizing a lot of that. And then empowerment, right? Empowering students, like in my mindfulness minutes, there's a little description before each one, and it just talks about like how you can what your options are. You can engage fully, you can take parts or pieces, you can leave the room, you can go to the safety of your own mind, you can get on your phone and scroll Instagram if you need to, and it just kind of talks people through, how to self-pace, I guess, and that's another piece of scaffolding, I think, to this idea. So
when you think about faculty at SUU, if there's a faculty member listening saying, and this could be true of any institution, but I'm just going to say SUU, and they want to get started in implementing some of these pre-learning strategies,
okay,
what is your recommendation?
Okay. Ooh, that's a great question, Matt. Okay, so if they want to get started in implementing them, I think the easiest bang for your buck sort of first step would be to start implementing something like a 5-minute practice at the beginning of your class. And you can either reach out to me if you want for some of my resources if you're not sure, or any kind of you can get on YouTube, you can get on Instagram, TikTok, all the socials. There's plenty of people offering you a 5-minute this or that. Start practicing your own.
Start with yourself first. Do it to yourself before.
Yes. I'm never going to ask my students to do something that I haven't done. Never, ever. And even then we'll have issues. I had a student that actually passed out in the middle of a breathing exercise, and we had to call campus police, and that was not planned, right? But I had done my best to make sure that was a good practice. So I would say start even now this summer. If they listen to that, I don't know when this comes out, but just try to give yourself if you don't already have a practice, give yourself a 5-minute practice of something every day, even if it's just mindfulness. Towards the end of the semester, we do one where we just walk through campus and I have a list of observe skills for grounding, right? Just give yourself some kind of 5-minute practice, and then for the first semester, if you just kind of want to dip your toe in pre-learning strategies, then just do a 5-minute practice with your students every time. But make sure it's one you've tried yourself, right? And that you understand that you can give enough informed consent, because it is important that you normalize the idea of discomfort, and you also empower students to take or leave and that right to self-determination piece. So you do kind of need to understand a bit of that. But I think all faculty have experienced that to an extent, because just to write a syllabi, you kind of have to have that foundation, right?
Right.
And then, so I would say just do that. Just do the 5-minute practice in the beginning, because you might not always know why the foundational skill is working, but it's just like anything. I can't necessarily explain to you why broccoli is good for me, but I can notice a difference in my body, right? Yeah. Same kind of idea. So I would say that's probably the biggest thing. And then if you want to continue to build up, so maybe try that for a whole semester. That's what I did. For one full semester, that's all I did. And then I started to consider, okay, what are the other pieces that seem to be showing up in my course evals around really maturity, developmental maturity, right? And any faculty member can think about a child that they knew or raised or whatever. What were some of the things that they had to get, and how do I want to kind of help support that? So I guess a more concise way to say that was, if you want to move past the mindfulness minute, then take on kind of a developmental lens and intervene in a place where you think might be useful. If you want to try to start learning about some of this stuff, any kind of education around developmental-based learning or trauma-informed classrooms. And as a side note, little plug, myself and a BSW intern, Julianne, developed informed classrooms model. There is one on your Canvas learning tools.
Okay.
But it's just copies another university, and we actually developed one last year, so hopefully it'll be there by fall that you can look into as well.
We'll gladly promote that for you.
Okay, that would be awesome because it's exceptional. She did most of the work, but it's based off all of kind of this stuff that I have in this content. So
great.
Yeah, that's another way to do it.
And I think, as you just pointed out, that start with yourself, but then don't feel like you have to do everything.
No.
Little pieces.
Yeah. If you do, you'll probably hate it and be like, forget this. It doesn't work. And give up. But yeah, if you, I would say just keep practicing with yourself. Each time a student, I mean, my faculty members talk about it in a brilliant way, but they have developmental education, right? They'll say, you know those emails that you get that you have to wait till tomorrow to respond to from a student? We all know those things.
Or adults too. Trust me, there's those emails from adults too.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure you probably get a lot more of those than I do. But yeah, like any of those kinds of practices that you're like, oh yeah, this student is one I have to take a second, or I've got to talk to a colleague about, or, you know, starting to notice and acknowledge how that skill set is actually what your students need, and develop, and just continuing to develop your own practice will support you in figuring out what pieces your students need. Because they might be slightly varied, but I would argue that I would guess that, because when I presented, we had faculty from all over the university. And so I took a minute and kind of was like, okay, so if you're doing math or if you're doing geoscience or whatever, and I think it's pretty applicable. So, yeah.
Well, Chelsea, thank you for coming in and talking to me about this topic. I truly do believe that at SU we want to do what's best for students and set them up for success, whether that's success for the one class and to have the skills to handle heavy topics, or down the road where we know they're going to run into some of these topics. I appreciate what you've presented today as well as at the Learning and Development event.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing the course that you and Kyle build.
Yeah, me too. So, I'm excited. I'd love for you to look it over. So thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Thanks. As you can see, there's a lot of work that has to take place before we start bringing up difficult conversations in our classrooms. And while academic freedom supports us in addressing these difficult conversations, we also have to take steps to help our students learn how to think from different perspectives and how to handle conversations that may be uncomfortable. In our next episode, we're going to talk to Student Outreach and Support Services representatives Heather Callison and Rachel Brenly, and discuss what resources are available to faculty when students are struggling. Join us next time on Southern Utah University's Teaching and Learning Podcast.